What's the worst I hate to break it to you moment you had with someone? Story 1. I was working as a manager at a tech company, and we had this employee named James who was convinced he was getting a promotion. He had been going around the office for weeks telling everyone how he was going to be promoted to a leadership role, even though he wasn't really performing well. His work was average at best, often late, and he didn't really show any leadership skills. But his confidence was off the charts. He started wearing suits to work and staying late, trying to make it obvious that he was the perfect candidate. When the time came for promotions, James wasn't even considered. It was tough, but I had to be the one to tell him the news. I pulled him into my office, and before I could say a word, he smiled and said, "I'm ready for the new role." I hated to break it to him, but I had to. I told him, "James, I hate to break it to you, but you didn't get the promotion." The look on his face was devastating. He was shocked, clearly not expecting it at all. "But I've been working so hard," he said, barely able to hide his disappointment. I had to explain that while his effort was noticed, it wasn't enough to secure the role this time. He left my office without another word, and the next day, he didn't wear a suit. It was one of the hardest conversations I've had to have in my life. Story 2. Back in high school, I was the captain of the basketball team. My best friend Eric had been trying out for the team for 3 years straight, but never made the cut. He wasn't a bad player, but he wasn't great either. Every year, he would come to tryouts and give it his all, and every year he would get cut. The worst part was that Eric truly believed that this year was going to be his year. He was practicing every day, talking about how he was going to make the team, and getting excited for the season. The tryouts came, and unfortunately, Eric didn't make the cut again. The coach pulled me aside and asked if I could be the one to tell him. It was the hardest thing I had to do. Eric came up to me after practice, all smiles, and said, "So, when do we start?" I hated to break it to him, but I had to tell him the truth. "Eric, I hate to break it to you, but you didn't make the team this year." His face fell, and I could see how crushed he was. He didn't say much after that, just nodded and walked away. We were still friends, but I knew that moment would always be a sore spot for him. Story 3. I was dating a girl named Sarah for about 2 years, and things seemed to be going really well, or so I thought. We had been talking about moving in together, traveling, and even discussing the future in terms of marriage and kids. I was ready to take the next step, so I decided I was going to propose to her. I spent weeks planning it out, getting the perfect ring, and arranging a special night where I would pop the question. The night came and everything was set. Candles, music, a fancy dinner, the whole deal. But as I sat across from her at dinner, she looked uneasy. I couldn't figure out what was wrong, so I asked her if she was okay. That's when she dropped the bomb on me. "I hate to break it to you," she said, "but I don't think this is working anymore. I want to break up." I was absolutely blindsided. I hadn't seen it coming at all. One minute I was preparing to propose, and the next, she was breaking up with me. I didn't even have a chance to say anything. I just sat there in shock as she explained that she didn't see a future for us anymore. It was probably the most devastating moment I'd ever had, and to this day, I still can't believe how quickly everything fell apart. Story 4. One of the worst I hate to break it to you moments I had was with my younger brother Tim. He was absolutely obsessed with this girl from his school, Emily, and they had been dating for about a year. He was convinced that they were going to be together forever, and he had even started talking about how they were going to go to college together and get married someday. The problem was that I knew something he didn't. Emily had been cheating on him with another guy from her class. I found out through a mutual friend, and I struggled for days on whether or not I should tell Tim. Finally, I decided it was better that he knew. I pulled him aside one night after dinner and said, "Tim, I hate to break it to you, but Emily's been seeing someone else." He didn't believe me at first, thought I was messing with him. But when I showed him the proof, he was crushed. He didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there in disbelief. It was one of those moments where I wished I didn't have to be the one to tell him, but I knew I had to. Story 5. I used to work as a guidance counselor at a high school, and one of my responsibilities was helping students with college applications. One student, Amanda, had her heart set on going to Yale. She worked hard throughout high school, top of her class, student body president, involved in numerous extracurriculars. She was the model student, and she was confident that Yale was going to be her future. She talked about it nonstop, and everyone around her was convinced she was going to get in. The problem was, even though she had done everything right, Yale is one of the most competitive schools, and even the best students sometimes don't make it. When acceptance letters went out, Amanda came to my office all excited, thinking her letter was going to be the one that changed her life. But I had already seen the results. She hadn't been accepted. I dreaded having to tell her, but I knew it was better if she heard it from someone she trusted. I sat her down and said, "Amanda, I hate to break it to you, but Yale didn't accept your application." Her face just crumpled. She was devastated, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She tried to stay composed, but it was clear how crushed she was. That moment will stay with me forever, because I knew how much she had worked for it, and there was nothing I could say to make it better. Story 6. I once had to fire a good friend of mine, and it was by far one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. We had known each other for years and ended up working at the same company. I had been promoted to a managerial role, and unfortunately, he wasn't performing up to standard. His work was sloppy, deadlines were being missed, and complaints from other team members were piling up. I tried to coach him through it, giving him multiple chances to improve, but nothing changed. My boss finally told me that it was time to let him go, and I knew it had to come from me. I called him into my office, and he walked in smiling, thinking we were just going to catch up. I hated to break it to him, but I had no choice. I said, "I hate to break it to you, but we have to let you go." His face went from happy to shocked in a split second. He couldn't believe it, and for a moment, I thought he was going to get angry. But instead, he just sat there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. That was one of the worst moments in my career, because it wasn't just a colleague I was firing, it was a friend.
Story 7. I was in college, and my roommate Jake had been in a relationship with his girlfriend Lily for almost 2 years. They seemed pretty solid from the outside, but I knew something he didn't. Lily had been cheating on him with another guy from her class. The guy was always around our dorm, and it didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. I struggled with whether to tell Jake or not because I didn't want to ruin his relationship or hurt him, but I also couldn't let him go on thinking everything was fine. One night after a party, we were sitting in our dorm, and he started talking about how he was planning to propose to Lily after graduation. I couldn't take it anymore, so I said, "Jake, I hate to break it to you, but Lily's been seeing someone else." He looked at me like I'd just hit him. "What? No way," he said. I showed him the messages I had seen, and his face went pale. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the floor. That was the worst I had ever seen him, and I knew things between us would never be the same. Story 8. One of the toughest moments I had was when I had to tell my cousin that his business idea wasn't going to work. He had been working on this startup for nearly a year, pouring his time, money, and energy into it. The problem was that his concept was flawed from the beginning. He was too optimistic about the market and didn't do enough research. I had stayed quiet about my concerns for a while, but it got to the point where I couldn't let him keep going without saying something. We were at a family barbecue, and he was talking excitedly about how he was going to launch in a few months. I pulled him aside and said, "I hate to break it to you, but this idea isn't going to work." He looked confused, almost like he didn't hear me right. "What do you mean?" he asked. I explained all the reasons I thought the business would fail. The market was oversaturated, his funding wasn't enough, and his business plan had holes. He didn't take it well. He got defensive, said I didn't believe in him, and stormed off. It was a tough conversation, and even though I knew I was doing the right thing, it still felt terrible to see him so upset. Story 9. I was dating a girl named Jenna for about 6 months, and we were getting pretty serious. We had met through mutual friends, and everything seemed to be going great. One night I was out with a few friends when I saw her with another guy at a bar. They were clearly more than just friends, holding hands and laughing like they were on a date. My heart sank. I didn't confront her then and there, but I knew I had to say something. The next day, we met up for lunch, and I could barely keep it together. As we sat down, she started talking about our plans for the weekend, completely unaware that I knew what she had been up to. I interrupted her and said, "I hate to break it to you, but I saw you with someone else last night." Her face went white. She tried to deny it at first, but then she just sat back and sighed. "I didn't think you'd find out," she admitted. It was like a punch to the gut. I broke up with her right then and there, and it was one of the hardest things I've had to do. Story 10. I used to work in a retail store, and there was this one customer, Mrs. Thompson, who came in every week. She was an older woman, super sweet, and always talked about her daughter who had moved to the city for a big job. Mrs. Thompson was so proud of her daughter and loved to brag about how successful she was. One day, Mrs. Thompson came in looking more excited than usual. She had bought a new phone and wanted me to help her set up FaceTime so she could talk to her daughter. As we were going through the contacts on her phone, I noticed something strange. There were messages from someone with the same name as her daughter, but they were dated from over a year ago. I scrolled through the recent calls and realized there hadn't been any from her daughter in months. I didn't want to say anything, but Mrs. Thompson noticed I looked concerned. "What is it?" she asked. I hated to break it to her, but I told her, "Mrs. Thompson, I don't think your daughter has been in touch recently." She looked at me, confused, then checked her phone. After a long pause, she said, "I haven't heard from her in months. I didn't realize how long it had been." It was heartbreaking to see her realize that her daughter had been distancing herself for so long. She thanked me for helping, but I could tell she was deeply hurt. Story 11. I was managing a small team at a marketing firm, and we had this one team member, Carla, who was always full of energy and ideas. She was convinced that one of her campaigns was going to be a huge hit, constantly talking about how it was going to revolutionize the way we approached our clients. The problem was that the campaign had a lot of flaws, and the data showed that it wasn't performing as well as she thought it would. After weeks of Carla pushing the idea, I had to sit her down and tell her the truth. "Carla," I said, "I hate to break it to you, but the campaign isn't doing as well as you think." She stared at me for a moment, her confidence deflating. "What do you mean?" "I thought it was going great," she said. I had to show her the numbers, and as she looked over the data, I could see the realization setting in. It was tough to watch because she had put so much effort into it, but it just wasn't working. We had to scrap the campaign, and though she understood, it was still hard for her to accept. Story 12. My dad had been working on restoring an old car for years. It was his pride and joy, something he had been tinkering with in the garage since I was a kid. He always talked about how one day he would get it running again and take it for a spin. One weekend he was getting close to finishing, and he asked me to help him start the engine for the first time in decades. I could tell he was excited, but as soon as we turned the key, nothing happened. We tried again, and still nothing. My dad looked confused, so I started checking under the hood. After a few minutes, I realized that a crucial part of the engine was completely shot, and we wouldn't be able to get it running without replacing it, which would cost a fortune. I hated to break it to him, but I said, "Dad, I don't think this is going to work." He looked devastated. "But I've spent years on this," he said quietly. I explained what was wrong, and though he tried to stay positive, I could tell how much it hurt him to realize his dream car wasn't going to run anytime soon. Story 13. Back in my high school days, there was this guy, Nick, who was absolutely convinced that he was going to get a football scholarship. He wasn't a bad player, but he wasn't the standout star he thought he was either. He talked about it all the time, how scouts were going to notice him, how he was going to get offers from big schools, and how he was set for a big future in football. The truth, though, was that no scouts were coming to our games to watch Nick. They were there for other players, but Nick was so sure of himself that he didn't see it. As captain of the team, I knew he wasn't on anyone's radar. One day after practice, Nick came up to me excitedly talking about an email he was planning to send to a coach from a major university. He was convinced they were interested. I hated to do it, but I had to be honest. "Nick," I said, I hate to break it to you, but no one's looking at you for a scholarship. I think you need to start thinking about other options." He just stood there, staring at me like I'd crushed his dreams. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I've worked so hard for this." I nodded, feeling terrible, but I knew he needed to hear the truth before he got his hopes up even higher. He didn't say much after that, just walked away quietly. A few days later, he started looking into other career paths, but I could tell it was a tough pill to swallow. Story 14. I had this friend, Melanie, who had been in a long-distance relationship for over a year. She was head over heels for this guy, Josh, and talked about how they were going to move in together once he finished his degree. The problem was, Josh wasn't as committed as Melanie thought. I had heard from mutual friends that he had been seeing other people and wasn't really taking their relationship seriously. Melanie, on the other hand, was already looking at apartments for the two of them. It was clear she was completely in the dark. One day, she asked me to help her pick out some furniture for the place they were planning to get together, and I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Mel," I said, "I hate to break it to you, but I've heard that Josh isn't being faithful." She looked at me in shock, shaking her head like she couldn't believe it. "What are you talking about?" she asked, clearly hurt. I explained what I'd heard, and at first she didn't want to believe it. But after a few days, she confronted him, and it turned out to be true. She was devastated, but eventually she thanked me for being honest. It took a while for her to move on, but at least she didn't waste any more time on someone who wasn't serious about her. Story 15. My coworker, Paul, had been working on a big project for months. He was convinced that it was going to revolutionize the way our company did business, and he had poured every ounce of energy into it. The issue was, everyone else in the office could see that the project wasn't as groundbreaking as Paul thought it was. In fact, it was full of flaws that would probably cause more problems than solutions. But Paul was so enthusiastic that no one wanted to burst his bubble. Finally, our boss asked me to sit down with Paul and explain why the project wasn't going to move forward. I dreaded the conversation, but it had to be done. "Paul," I said during our meeting, "I hate to break it to you, but the higher-ups aren't going to approve your project. There are too many issues with it." He looked at me in disbelief. "But I've been working on this for months," he said, frustration and sadness mixing in his voice. I explained the concerns, and though he tried to argue at first, he eventually realized that the project wasn't going to happen. It was tough watching him process the news, but at least it saved him from investing more time in something that wasn't going to work. Story 16. I was at a family dinner when my cousin Amanda announced that she had finally gotten the job she'd been interviewing for over the past few months. She was so excited, talking about how the company was going to change her life and that she'd be making more money than ever before. The whole family was congratulating her, and she was absolutely glowing. The only problem was that I had heard from a mutual friend that the company she was hired by was notorious for being a scam. They hired people with big promises, made them pay for their own training and materials, and then let them go without ever actually paying them for their work. I didn't want to rain on her parade, but I couldn't let her walk into that situation blindly. So after dinner, I pulled her aside and said, "Amanda, I hate to break it to you, but I've heard some really bad things about that company." She looked at me, confused, not wanting to believe it. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I explained everything I knew, and she seemed devastated. She hadn't signed any contracts yet, so she did some research, and it turned out everything I said was true. She ended up not taking the job, but I knew it crushed her to have her excitement replaced with disappointment so quickly. Story 17. My friend Jake was in the middle of planning his dream vacation to Europe. He had been saving up for years, researching all the best spots to visit, and had even booked flights and accommodations for what he thought would be the trip of a lifetime. However, a few weeks before he was set to leave, I discovered that his entire itinerary was built on outdated information. Many of the places he wanted to visit had either closed down or changed significantly since his research. I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I knew it was important. I called him up and said, "Jake, I hate to break it to you, but some of the places you plan to visit in Europe have closed or changed recently." He was silent for a moment, clearly shocked. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I showed him the updated information I had found, and he was disheartened to realize that his carefully laid plans were falling apart. He had to scramble to revise his itinerary and make last-minute adjustments. Though he was frustrated, he appreciated the heads-up, even if it meant his dream vacation wasn't going to be as perfect as he had envisioned.
Story 18. My college roommate, Laura, had been dating a guy named Mike for almost a year. She was completely smitten and kept talking about how they were going to move in together after graduation. However, I noticed Mike was often out with friends and rarely made time for Laura. One night, I overheard a conversation between Mike and his friends, where he mentioned he wasn't actually as committed as Laura thought. I knew it was a tough situation, but I decided to tell her the truth. "Laura, I hate to break it to you, but I've heard Mike talking about how he isn't as serious about the relationship as you are." Laura was taken aback, her face falling. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shared what I'd overheard, and she was devastated. She confronted Mike and found out that her suspicions were true. It was a hard breakup, but at least she knew where she stood and could move on without wasting more time. Story 19. My neighbor Greg was constantly bragging about his new business venture that he claimed was going to make him a millionaire. He had invested a lot of money and was very vocal about how successful it was going to be. One day, I ran into a mutual acquaintance who had been involved in a similar venture and warned me that Greg's business model was flawed and likely to fail. I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I felt it was necessary. I approached Greg and said, "Greg, I hate to break it to you, but I've heard some concerning things about your business model. You might want to take a closer look at it." He was initially dismissive, but as things started to go wrong, he came back to me for advice. It was hard seeing him struggle, but I was glad I had tried to help him avoid a complete disaster. Story 20. My old friend Emma had just started a new relationship and was completely head over heels for her new boyfriend Mark. She had already started planning their future together, including talking about getting married and having kids. However, I happened to find out from a mutual friend that Mark had a history of being unreliable and had left previous relationships under questionable circumstances. I knew I had to say something. "Emma, I hate to break it to you, but I've heard some things about Mark that you should know. He has a reputation for being unreliable in relationships." Emma was stunned and hurt. "Are you serious?" she asked, her face pale. I explained what I knew, and though she initially resisted, she eventually took the information seriously. She began to see some red flags and started to reassess the relationship. It was a difficult process, but she was grateful for the honesty. Story 21. My cousin Ryan was obsessed with a car he wanted to buy. He had saved up a significant amount of money and was so excited about the purchase, talking about it nonstop. The car was a classic model he had always dreamed of owning. However, I knew that the specific model he wanted had a notorious reputation for frequent breakdowns and expensive repairs. I didn't want to ruin his excitement, but I felt it was important to let him know. "Ryan, I hate to break it to you, but that model you're looking at has a lot of issues with reliability and repairs. It might be worth reconsidering." He was taken aback and frustrated. "I've already set my heart on this," he said. I provided him with some resources to research and confirmed my concerns. He ended up doing more research and decided to go for a different model, which turned out to be a much better choice in the long run. Story 22. My colleague Jane was thrilled about her promotion to a managerial position. She had been working towards it for years and was excited about the new responsibilities and salary increase. However, I found out from HR that the role was going to come with some significant challenges and that the previous person in the role had left due to the intense stress and unrealistic expectations. I knew it was important for Jane to be prepared. "Jane, I hate to break it to you, but I've heard that the managerial position comes with a lot of challenges that might not be immediately obvious. The previous person struggled a lot." Jane's excitement dimmed as she processed the information. "Are you sure?" she asked. I reassured her with what I knew, and she took it seriously. She approached the role with more caution and was able to navigate the challenges better by being prepared for them. Story 23. My high school friend Chris was starting a new band and was super excited about their upcoming debut. He was convinced they were going to be the next big thing, and he talked about it constantly. However, I had heard from other local musicians that their sound was quite similar to a very well-known band, and it might be hard for them to stand out. I didn't want to dampen his enthusiasm, but I knew he should be aware of potential challenges. Chris, I hate to break it to you, but your band's sound is quite similar to an existing popular band. You might face some challenges distinguishing yourselves. Chris looked deflated and confused, but we've worked so hard on this. I suggested he try to find a unique angle or tweak their sound to stand out. It was a hard conversation, but he appreciated the feedback and used it to refine their approach. Story 24. My friend Olivia had been tirelessly working on her startup for over a year and was finally ready to launch. She was extremely confident that her product was going to be a huge hit in the market. However, I had learned from industry insiders that the market was already saturated with similar products, and her unique selling points might not be enough to stand out. I knew I had to tell her the truth. Olivia, I hate to break it to you, but the market for your product is pretty saturated. You might want to reconsider your strategy or find a different angle. She was visibly disappointed. I didn't realize that. I provided her with some suggestions on how to differentiate her product, and she started working on adjustments to her launch plan. It was a tough realization, but it helped her pivot to a more viable strategy.